All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, on the line, I've got Ben Freeman from the Quincy Institute. Responsible Statecraft is the name of their website, responsiblestatecraft.org, where he writes great things. Welcome back. How you doing, Ben?
I'm doing great, Scott. Always a pleasure to be talking with you.
Great. Happy to have you here. What a great piece you wrote. How weapons firms influence the Ukraine debate. Well, come on. Aren't they bound by some sort of honor system to stay out of the argument about whether we should be, shopping for their wares?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Scouts honor. The defense contractors are always going to do the right thing, right?
Yeah. No, but so you're telling me they would be so cynical as to finance the think tanks that recommend that the U.S. government purchase big ticket items from them?
Right. I would tell you that. And I know that, this is a topic that I'm sure is not going to surprise any of your listeners. And really anyone who's been paying attention to the Ukraine debate, knows that most of the talking heads that you see on TV are in the papers or, on most radio stations, not called the Scott Horton Show. They're hearing from folks that are on the take of the defense industry. So what we tried to do was to see if our hunch was right. We did a big investigation of it. And what we found was that your hunch is absolutely right. All the talking heads you're hearing are, at least in part, or de facto, on the payroll of the defense sector.
Mm-hmm. And so the full PDF file is called Defense Contractor Funded Think Tanks Dominate Ukraine Debate. And so, look, it's just one pretty sharp peek into what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. Of course, the military firms funnel the smallest percentage of their taxpayer revenue back into public relations to keep the whole thing going. Were they going to not do that? Of course they're going to do that. But then it turns out that there's not really anybody else on the same ball field with them. So virtually all the foreign policy think tanks, with maybe a very few exceptions, are financed by Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, etc. Correct? What are the exceptions? I'm sure it'd be a lot shorter list.
That's right. Yeah, it was overwhelming when we started looking at the funding of all these think tanks. In fact, the top 10 ranked foreign policy think tanks, every single one of them takes defense sector money. If you go back out a little bit from that, you start looking at the top 25, still most of those, so 78% of those take defense sector money. And you do have a few exceptions, places like the Quincy Institute, of course, we don't take any defense industry or DOD money. Places like the Independent Institute, Human Rights Watch, folks like that. But most of the big players and really most of the folks you hear on these big media outlets, their employers are all funded by the defense industry.
Mm-hmm. And now the Kochs, they do have interests, but not military ones. That's never been their deal. So
right,
the whole Kochtopus is a bit independent from that.
Yeah, that's right. And folks like to point out the Quincy Institute is partially funded through Koch money. But the Kochs have gotten out of Russia. They've given up all their business interests there. So, we at QI, we don't have a dog in the fight when it comes to the Ukraine war. We just want what's best for U.S. foreign policy. We want a lively debate about what's best for U.S. foreign policy. But what this report reveals is that the supposed public debate that we're having is a debate that is overwhelmingly biased towards defense industry interests.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know it would be naive. I understand the current system and everything, but This should be all completely blatant conflict of interest. This isn't just, geez, they sort of, they have a bias. This is unbelievable that Lockheed gets to play this big of a role in setting the entire discussion of American foreign policy the way that they do.
Right. Yeah, it's phenomenal. And that was another big thing that we found is, not only is there all this defense sector money flowing to all these think tanks, that these think tanks, when they're producing articles, reports of their own that have direct financial benefits for those funders, and they're not disclosing it. So they're putting out reports that, for example, recommend sending arms to Ukraine, and specific arms made by specific people who we know specifically fund the think tank they work at. And yet in all these articles, these reports, they're just not disclosing that conflict of interest. And for us, at the very least, that they should be doing that in these articles. And media outlets that are quoting them, it's incumbent upon them when they're citing these articles and reports, let your readers know that expert you're citing who says we should send tanks or F-16s to Ukraine, let your readers know that person works at a place that's funded by the manufacturers of those weapons they recommend sending to Ukraine.
Yeah. Or better yet, label it, this is a paid advertisement from this corporation, and we're not even running it as an op-ed at all because it would be a conflict of interest. I don't know. So can you go through, first of all, for the people not familiar, which are the top 10 think tanks, if you could do that off the top of your head, and who are the top funders of them?
Yeah. Good question. Let's see if I can get the top 10 right. It's an interesting correlation here, right off the bat. Our top foreign policy think tanks are some probably household names for a lot of your listeners. Places like the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Center for a New American Security, the Atlantic Council, the Brookings Institution, the Council on Foreign Relations, RAND as well, which is effectively the DoD's own think tank. It's almost a majority of its money is funded by DoD itself. So in all of these places are all the top foreign policy think tanks, but every single one of those think tanks I just mentioned there, they take big money from the defense sector. The Atlantic Council and CSIS, for example, they were sort of, prime examples in the report of think tanks where we're seeing this process go on, where they're heavily funded by the defense sector, defense contractors, and they're heavily quoted in media outlets. In fact, they were the top two, most quoted media outlets that we found related to the Ukraine war. And over again, we saw scholars at those think tanks recommending that the U.S. provide weapons to Ukraine that would directly financially benefit the funders of their think tank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you watch your mouth or the Atlantic Council will get you kicked off of Twitter for misinformation. They'll have PolitiFact fact check your article and see whether they like every bit of it or not.
I welcome them to. At the end of the day, I'm a researcher, and so we did our due diligence on it. This report was 4 months in the making, and so we painstakingly went through all these articles. We looked at more than 1,000 different articles where think tanks have been cited. We looked at the Atlantic Council's publications, droves of them. CSIS, same thing. All these think tanks. We did our due diligence. So, I welcome anybody to take a look at the report, and, if they've got questions, they can bring them to me. I'm happy to discuss that. But
no, they'll just accuse you of being a Russian plant and leave it at that. They'll say this is disinformation, and they won't have to demonstrate it. And the Atlantic Council, really, I'm just making a crack about the role that they've played in the censorship industry since the invention of Russiagate and COVID and the Ukraine war, that they've been really central to who's allowed to discuss the policies that they demand.
That's
at
right.
the behest of these arms salesmen.
That's right. And that's really how this think tank echo chamber and funding enterprise works. At the end of the day, these are multi-million-dollar. They're ostensibly nonprofit organizations, right? Think tanks are. But some of these think tanks, like the Brookings Institution, for example, they have a budget that's almost $100 million. And so when you're trying to fill those coffers, you at some level, you have to be beholden to your funders. And those funders, they're just not going to keep giving you money if you say things that they don't like. So this whole system then it becomes sort of Darwinian, and then, it's the survival of the funded. So if you don't play ball with these big money funders, with these defense contractors, who in some cases are giving millions of dollars to these think tanks, if you as a scholar there keep saying things that they don't like, you will get fired. You will lose your job, or that think tank will stop receiving money from that defense contractor. And that think tank, in some cases, think tanks go out of business because funders, they pull the money they're providing to them. So all of this helps to create this sort of funding ecosystem that results in an echo chamber that benefits the defense sector.
Mm-hmm. And I love how in your study here you have footnotes to all their crazy hawkish articles too. Demonstrating your case. All right, so I have a fun anecdote from a long time ago. It's Richard Cummings. I think we probably talked about this before because it's one of the few anecdotes I remember. Richard Cummings wrote this great article for Playboy.com in 2007 called Lockheed Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. And it was about, everybody always emphasized the neoconservatives' ties to Likud. And he said, yeah, but look at their ties to Lockheed and how so many of, especially the Bush administration, neocons in the vice president's office and the Defense Department, the National Security Council and so forth, that these guys, including Dick Cheney's wife, was on the board of directors of Lockheed. And so many of these guys were directly tied to it. And then he told the history of how, and I can never remember the plane. I know I need to memorize it for my anecdote. But they had developed this plane in the 70s that was supposed to compete with a DC-10 or a 737, I guess. And it didn't. I think Delta bought a few of them, and then it was a flop. Nobody wanted the plane. And they'd spent a couple of $1 billion developing the thing. And so they said, well, that's it. We're just not going to compete in the market anymore. We're going to target the Pentagon only as our one and only captive customer. And then we'll just emphasize, put all of our engineering and development into controlling Congress and gerrymandering House districts and financing think tanks. And they even held a meeting where they said, even with just the one customer, if we don't set the policy, how are we going to know what kind of weapons to build? So we need to come up with what the policy is. That way we know whether we should build tanks for the sand or tanks for the woods or tanks for the what. And so that's just how it goes. It makes perfect sense from their point of view. It's perfectly rational. It's just that somebody's supposed to be organized to stop them, but they're not.
Yeah. I mean, because everybody here is incentive. There's a financial incentive to not stop them and to just, become part of this complex. And at the end of the day, I think it's very disingenuous to call Lockheed a private company. This is crony capitalism. This is a company that, has a one customer, like you mentioned. The vast majority of their revenue comes from that one customer. And then they spend literally tens of millions, in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars a year trying to influence that customer, to try and influence the foreign policy debate to benefit their bottom line. And the result of it all is a U.S. foreign policy that is way more militarized than it would otherwise be.
Yeah. Hang on just one second. Hey, y'all, the audiobook of my book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, is finally done. Yes, of course, read by me. It's available at Audible, Amazon, Apple Books, and soon on Google Play and whatever other options there are out there. It's my history of America's war on terrorism from 1979 through today. Give it a listen and see if you agree. It's time to just come home. Enough already. Time to End the War on Terrorism. The audiobook. Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Man, I wish I was in school so I could drop out and sign up for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom instead. Tom has done such a great job on putting together a classical curriculum for everyone from junior high schoolers on up through the postgraduate level. And it's all very reasonably priced. Just make sure you click through from the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Real history, real economics, real education. All right, so tell me, which are the biggest arms industry brand names that we know besides Lockheed? Are they still the top of the heap when it comes to spending on this kind of thing?
Yeah. Lockheed is still, far and away number one. When it comes to think tank funding, though, some of the big players are some of the other top five. Folks like Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. They were big funders too. Millions of dollars every year going from these folks to think tanks. And so, Lockheed's certainly not the only player here. All these other folks are doing this too. And I think in all these cases, we're able to identify whether it's Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, or whether we're able to identify in this report, in forthcoming articles too, how those specific funders in funding think tanks, those think tanks are recommending specific weapons that are made by those specific funders. This is not even like a blanket thing that these think tanks are just, calling for a more militarized foreign policy.
Right.
In many cases that we documented in the report, those think tanks are explicitly calling for the weapons made by these specific firms that fund them. And so, it's hard to imagine that all of this is just coincidental and that oops, I'm sorry, I just keep recommending over and over the product that you make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll never forget General McCaffrey shilling Bradley fighting vehicles during Iraq War II, even though, they had, I guess, very lightly armored bottoms and were quite susceptible to IEDs, and he's still going, no, we got to get those Bradleys over there. More Bradleys.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
He's on the board of directors of the company that made the Bradleys, and they never said that.
Yeah, speaking of the Iraq War too, Scott, one of my favorite new examples of this process is Elliot Cohen, who was famously one of the neocons back in the Bush administration, who was seemingly clamoring for Iraq War II. Wrote articles about how it would be. One
wrote
article
a big study for Heritage about how we're going to privatize all their oil for our cronies and get this, bankrupt the Saudis and take over OPEC.
Right.
Really smart guy.
Yeah, but and now he's back again talking about the Ukraine war. He's a scholar at CSIS now, and he's opining now about the Ukraine war and how the U.S. needs to provide him with all these weapons and everything. But you go through what he's recommending, and all the weapons he's recommending the U.S. give to Ukraine are made by firms that fund his employer CSIS. And none of this is disclosed in the articles he's writing about this. And, I flagged this for the article as a piece in The Atlantic. I flagged it for him on Twitter. He had a snarky tweet at me that he deleted. But in all these cases, he's recommending these things that could very well lead to an escalation of the war, drag the U.S. into it, without disclosing what I think is a very clear conflict of interest here.
Mm-hmm. I met a leftist one time years ago who said that, America is not even really a place. America is just where foreigners come and hire this giant mercenary army to do their dirty work for them. And which makes sense. There are anecdotes of the Saudis and the Kuwaitis talking about forward march, white trash slave, all of a sudden who's the, Americans can be very racist against Arabs, but it's like, hey, wait a minute. What did he just call me? Yeah. But then, so it's the same kind of thing with these arms manufacturers too, where the idea of any sort of patriotism or sense of, responsibility in this society at all or for its future at all are just have absolutely nothing to do with any consideration here. And they would just rather continue to fight forever until America's destroyed because it's in it for them. In the short-term interest, it makes sense,
Right, 100%. For them, war is a business. War is literally their business. They make money when wars occur. And they even tell their stockholders this on earnings calls. My colleague Eli Clifton has documented this over and over, how they have publicly stated they're looking at the Ukraine war as a business opportunity. And the problem is that this creates this militarized U.S. response to this war, which is absolutely not what U.S. citizens want. And I'm going to spoil some forthcoming Quincy Institute public opinion work that we have coming out in a couple of weeks. But basically what we found in it was that Americans overwhelmingly, they want the U.S. to pursue a diplomatic solution to this war. They don't want this war to keep going on. They want the U.S. to do more, to try to get all parties to come to the table to end this thing peacefully without keeping it going and keeping the risks of all these other bad things happening out there. So where the American public has a more restrained foreign policy view here, the defense contractors keep pushing this militarized narrative for the Ukraine war.
Right. Well, so what do we do about it? Who is organized to stop them other than you and Eli, who I've been relying on for so many years?
Yeah. My colleague Bill Hartung, too. All my colleagues.
That's right.
Institute are wonderful. But Bill Hartung actually has a new report coming out, too, on the waste in the overall Pentagon budget that I think all your listeners would love, too. We're trying, there are a few other good groups. I mentioned the Independent Institute earlier. They're wonderful. Yeah. We've got Chris Preble and those folks over at the Stimson Center now. Our friends at the Cato Institute, and a few other places too. There are still some good voices here in this space, but I think what we need to do is we've got to get those folks out there. We've got to get more of those folks talking, to folks like you and media outlets. And, we need to find some way to get our voices, wedge the door into some of these mainstream media outlets. So, we can go head to head in these policy debates in places like the New York Times, the Post, and, get on CNN, get us on Fox News. Because if we don't do that, then at the end of the day, we're not having a public debate on the Ukraine war. We're having a public echo chamber.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because it sounds kind of utopian, but also completely basic and rational at the same time to me, that the way it should work is whatever American firms are required to make tanks and fighting vehicles and armaments for our military, that they would all be required to do that, not at cost plus, but at cost. That's it. And if they want to make their profits, they're going to have to make their profits in other sectors. That's what made them successful manufacturing firms in the first place. But when it comes to arming up the military, well, that's your patriotic duty. And if we really have a crisis overseas that we have to meet, then I'm sure General Motors won't mind turning out some tanks at cost. I mean, and after all, hey, at least at cost. It's not like the guys, we're not covering the salaries of the guys putting the tanks together. But no, you don't get to profit from that. And no, you don't get to buy advertisements on TV to make NBC beholden to you. And you don't get to fund the think tanks that hire the Kagans to dominate the discussion on all of these wars. It's just completely bananas. I mean, I think if you just grabbed any average person anywhere and said, do you think that Northrop Grumman and the Kagans' consensus should always be the choice of the U.S. government in who we kill and what they do overseas and all these things? It just makes no sense. Robert Kagan runs PNAC. His wife runs CNAS. And she was Dick Cheney's Middle East advisor there for a while, or national security advisor for a while. Before she went, she's been working for the Democrats ever since then. Mm-hmm. It's completely bananas. And why? It's simply because some arms dealers said, hey, we really like the cut of her jib. There's got to be more to it than that. It should not be this way. Everyone could tell you, anyone could tell you, it should not be like this.
Right. I mean, it's folks like that they make the job of the defense contractors easy because when they're funding folks like that, they don't have to censor them. They don't have to tell them, say this and say that. They've already hired them in the first place because they know they're going to say the things that they want. And so that's why when we think about think tank funding, everybody thinks like, oh, well, it's going to bias people. It's going to, we're going to have some, salacious censorship scandal. Most of the time, what they're doing here, they're just controlling who gets a microphone and who doesn't.
Yeah.
They get to effectively have a veto on who becomes the head of these think tanks, who are the most prominent scholars, who get the most media coverage. Mm-hmm. And because they have all their people in place to begin with, they don't have to do the outright censorship just because they control the think tank environment so much.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, there's the famous clip. I mean, I'm sure other examples too, but there's the famous clip of Noam Chomsky telling the British interviewer who's saying, oh, you just think that I'm faking it and I don't believe the things I'm saying? And Chomsky's like, no, man, I'm just saying that they hired you because you are who you are and you believe the things that you believe. And that's why you're the one sitting in the chair asking me these questions in the first place. Don't you get it? And he's like, oh, yeah, I guess that does make sense. I forget exactly what he says, but it's basically like, yeah, okay. But so let me ask you this then. What about George Soros and the Quincy Institute? I think I read a thing that says that the Kochs and Soros were, in fact, it was a bit of a scandal in the first place, I guess, that the Kochs and Soros were teaming up in what seemed like the best way to some of us and the way that worried people when the Quincy Institute was first founded. But I think I read that George Soros got mad about y'all's stance on Ukraine and said he wasn't going to fund y'all anymore. Is that right?
Oh, I'm not familiar with that. I guess that's I haven't heard that, so I can't really speak to that. But I can tell you more generally about working at an organization that does have Soros and Koch funding. And by the way, I was at an organization before Quincy. I was at the Center for International Policy, which also had money from both received funding from both Soros and Koch. And I'll tell you, in both places, it's the same. I would always get, the Twitter trolls come at you, everybody's, ridiculing that and everything. At the end of the day, I have never once had either of those organizations censor anything, tell me I couldn't say something or tell me I had to do something, whatever. None of that. They've exerted no control or restraint over the work that I've done. And the reason for that is simple. Those organizations, they're pursuing peace. They're pursuing diplomacy. They're pursuing a more restrained U.S. foreign policy. And that's exactly what those organizations are funding them to do. And so, just like in a sense, how Lockheed Martin is funding some of these think tanks to advocate for a more militarized U.S. foreign policy, folks like George Soros and the Kochs, they want a more restrained foreign policy, and that's why they fund the work that we do. And so, is there a bias in our work because of that funding? Yes, it's a bias towards restraint. And that's what they want, and that's certainly what we want too.
And, from the beginning, I stuck up for you guys because all this is Jim Loeb's blog plus my best friends from the American Conservative magazine and so forth, the people that we've been running on antiwar.com for 20 years and more. So, Eli Clifton and Kelly Vlahos and all you great people. I mean, Eli's one of the co-founders of the thing.
That's right. Yeah.
And of course, Andrew Bacevich and Trita Parsi. I've known Trita for 15, 20 years, something like that now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really viewed the Quincy Institute when Bill Hartung and I joined together. I felt like it was like we were joining the Avengers late in the game. Besides, it was like the Avengers of peaceful, restraint-oriented folks. It's a great collection of people from across the ideological spectrum, all kinds of backgrounds, but I think all doing just really kick butt work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I Googled it while you were talking, and I can't find it. So I don't know where the hell I got that. I thought that I had remembered that Soros was complaining about, the little mini scandal when Joe Cirincione went and turned coat and started complaining about Quincy and the media and so forth. I thought that Soros had made a comment then, but I guess I might have been wrong about that. But and yeah, you know what? As long as we're at it, go ahead and go through that list again, because there's so many great people that write for the Quincy Institute, including our own Ted Snyder from time to time.
Yeah.
And
yeah, Ted. I mean,
you mentioned Bill Hartung there.
Yeah, Bill Hartung, Ben Armbruster, my colleagues Anatol Lieven and George Beebe. These are guys that just career folks. Understanding what's going on in Russia and Eastern Europe. The level of expertise is astounding. That responsible statecraft gets, and they're getting it over and over and over again, because it's one of the few places that you can turn to for an objective look at U.S. foreign policy, and where you have people that they're not biased by the defense sector. We don't take any defense industry funding, and so you're gonna get analyses at responsible statecraft that you're not going to see in a lot of other places.
Got that right. Good thing too. All right, and with that, I'll let you go, man. Thank you so much for your time on the show and for all your great work.
Hey, always a pleasure, Scott, and thank you for this show. It's much needed.
All right, thanks, man. Appreciate that. All right, you guys, that's Ben Freeman. He's at Quincy. It's responsiblestatecraft.org, how weapons firms influence the Ukraine debate, and the actual study itself. Oh no, I got to rewind to the top. The actual study itself is called Defense Contractor Funded Think Tanks Dominate Ukraine Debate. May 2023, Quincy Brief number 41. Excellent stuff.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.